Okay, hello everyone. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about quadratic funding, this new mechanism for funding public goods that Glenn Weil and myself came up with and have been working on, and some of our learnings from applying quadratic funding in the Ethereum blockchain ecosystem. So to start off, a quick introduction to what quadratic funding is. So the idea behind quadratic funding is it's a mechanism that solves the problem where basically you have some pool of money, some pool of funding that you want to allocate toward funding public goods, so funding projects that kind of benefit large groups of people, but where there is not necessarily a clear and obvious business model for them, but where you personally do not know exactly which projects are good to support, and so you want to basically kind of collect the opinions of the crowd to help you make the decision. So the way that quadratic funding works is that anyone can set up a project, and when you set up a project, you can collect donations through the mechanism, and these donations get matched, right, or they get subsidized. But the way that the matching works is using this kind of very particular formula. Basically, what happens is that you take all of the donations that went to a particular project, you take the square root of the amount of each donation, you add up all the square roots, and then you take the square of the sum. And that big square, this square of the sum of the square roots, is the amount that the project receives. Now, in general, you can mathematically prove that the square of the sum of the square roots is going to be, if there's more than one participant, greater than just the sum of the contributions themselves, and usually much greater. And the difference between the contributions and the kind of size of this big square basically comes out of this subsidy pool. Now, if there is not enough money to fully subsidize all the projects according to this formula, then you would calculate partial subsidies, right? So, for example, if there's only enough money to pay like 1/4 of the subsidy for every project, then you would only pay 1/4 of the subsidy for every project, and that's fine. So you might ask, well, why this strange formula, right? So like, why not, for example, just match all donations by a factor of 5? And there's some very kind of clever mathematical logic behind this. So there's two kind of very nice effects that quadratic funding gives you, right? So one of them is that the matching is greater the more people contribute, right? So the more public the public good is, the more of a subsidy that it gets. So if n people each donate $1, the total amount the project receives would be n squared, right? Like imagine each one of these squares kind of had a length and an area of 1, then this would be an area of 4, and then 4 squared, this would be 16. So n squared received by the project if there are n contributors, and this is n times greater than just the donations, right? The donations in this case would be 4. And this compensates for the kind of n-way tragedy of the commons, right? So kind of if you normally do the math, then if you try to just fund public goods with direct donations, and there's a public good that has n people that benefit from it, then generally the donations are not going to work that well because each participant only gets 1 out of n of the value of the public good. And so here, basically, all of the contributions get multiplied by n, and so you compensate for this. Another really nice benefit is that smaller contributions get matched more, right? So like even over here, for example, we can look at how this smaller square kind of corresponds to this fairly large matching kind of over here and over here. Whereas this larger square, well, there's still a match, and just as a number, the match is even larger, but just as a ratio, right? If you look at the ratio of kind of the match compared to the donation, it's obviously much larger for the smaller square than it is for the larger square. And so this is very nice, right? It makes quadratic funding kind of anti-plutocratic to a large extent, because someone who can only contribute $1 gets matched much more than someone who contributes, like, say, $10,000. So why quadratic funding in Ethereum, right? So first of all, the Ethereum community has many underfunded public goods. And in fact, all online communities have many underfunded public goods. One of the kind of big differences between physical space and cyberspace is that in cyberspace, there might even be even more public goods than there are private goods. Any open source code that you write is a public good. Any just article that you write and openly publish is a public good. Any forum post that you write is a public good. There's a lot of people in the present and in the future that read it and might benefit from it. And so in the Ethereum community also, there's a lot of software that needs to be written. There's a lot of research that needs to be done. There is a lot of documentation that needs to be written. There's a lot of education needs to be done, a translation, many, many public goods. Currently, the Ethereum Foundation kind of allocates the largest amount of funding toward public goods in a fairly centralized way, right? So the Ethereum Foundation's annual budget is about $30 million, and it just it does try to function as a fairly distributed organization. So, for example, instead of hiring employees and putting all the employees in one office, it gives grants. It finds ways to try to cooperate with other organizations. It encourages the recipients of the funding to remain very independent, but at the same time, the funding is still kind of controlled by a fairly small group of people. And the Ethereum Foundation sometimes gets criticized for funding only a limited scope of projects, right? There's a lot of cases where people just keep complaining and asking, wait, why has the Ethereum Foundation, which is willing to spend like $5 million on a zero-knowledge proof research, not yet funded like some small thing, like piece of software writing or whatever that particular person just considers to be extremely valuable, that the foundation just might not realize as is important. And so the question is, can we find a way to make the funding kind of decision making more diverse and more democratic and more kind of open and inclusive? And quadratic funding is just the perfect solution for this. So Gitcoin grants, it was originally a platform for providing bounties for people to kind of write code for projects on GitHub, but it's it evolved into this platform for supporting public goods in the Ethereum blockchain ecosystem. Right, so it's been running for something like 1.5 years now. It's done about 7 rounds of a quadratic funding, and the subsidies come from mostly the Ethereum Foundation, some from Consensus, and some from some individual contributors. And more recently, in round 7, there are many DeFi, decentralized finance projects that have also contributed. So over here, we can see this. These are the results for round 3. Round 3 was the 3rd round that had what I thought was a very significant level of usage. And so you can see over here, these are some of the top projects. The numbers in the white are just the donations by themselves, and the numbers in the green are the matching amounts. So ETH Hub received about $4,797 from 131 contributors, plus got about $16,000 in matching. ETH Hub is basically this just online resource that contains a lot of information about Ethereum. Austin Griffith, an independent Ethereum developer. Now, you might wonder, well, if these projects had over 100 contributors, then why is the matching only 2 times or 4 times bigger than the original donations? Like, shouldn't it be in something closer to 100 times bigger? The answer here basically is that, well, sometimes it's because most of the contributions come from one person. And if they come from one person, the matching is not large, right? So I think this is true with Lighthouse. But also, there's just so many contributions from that the amount of matching that can be done with the subsidies that were available is just much smaller than the amount of matching that could be provided from the formulas. And so like basically the all of the matching amounts were divided by something like at least a factor of 10. And then the formula was also modified in a somewhat different way. This is called pairwise bounded quadratic funding to try to minimize the risks of certain kinds of cheating. But in general, right, even with the modifications, the mechanism actually worked quite well. There's a lot of very valuable projects that got funded here. So this is round 3. This is round 4. So in round 4, we tried splitting the matching into 2 categories. One is technology projects, and the other is media projects. In technology case, our Tornado Cash, a privacy solution, a DApp node, something that makes it much easier to run a node, a Subleer, a kind of payment system that allows you to make subscription payments with, so for example, like payments that happen kind of over time, like either once a month or more frequently, potentially even once per second, without having to make a transaction for every payment. Uniswap, decentralized exchange, now extremely famous, obviously. And then media grants. Week in Ethereum News as just a newsletter that collects Ethereum related news. Anti-Prosynth, a Twitter account. We'll talk about him later. ETH Hub, as I mentioned. So a lot of great projects on both sides. Now, in round 4, we actually did see some controversies for the first time. So basically, the tech section was generally considered kind of fairly uncontroversial. People generally agreed that the projects that received the most money were very valuable projects. In the media section, things were a bit different, right? So Anti-Prosynthesis, this is this Twitter account who just said, I have a Twitter account and I just post Ethereum related content, and a lot of the content is just kind of retweeting kind of other Ethereum related news. Sometimes it's just kind of arguing in favor of Ethereum and kind of refuting incorrect arguments against Ethereum that come from the Bitcoin community. And so there's people have some different kind of criticisms of this, right? So one is that there was some perception that kind of being a Twitter influencer is not real work, right? So you know, writing code is hard work, writing long articles is hard work, but you know, just making posts on Twitter is something that lots of people do for free. And so why does this need to be compensated? So some people felt this way, but then a lot of other people disagreed, and they said that, no, this is a person who has been supporting the Ethereum ecosystem in a very dedicated way for 2 years, and he's being rewarded for this for only the first time. And actually, this gathering up all of this information, making sure that you're staying informed and providing all of these viewpoints does take a lot of knowledge and a lot of time, and we should not act like it doesn't. So we saw these 2 viewpoints, right? And then the second issue is that tech projects are generally kind of more purely beneficial, right? And tech projects obviously can have harmful effects, but it's much more rare, right? Tech projects generally just increase the possibility of what can be done. And if you don't like it, then you cannot use it. But media projects can potentially have upsides and downsides, right? So like, for example, one possible downside of this style of arguing is just that, like, some people would say that it makes Ethereum look bad, right? That it's basically paying people to kind of argue with people who dislike Ethereum on Twitter, and other people disagree. But regardless of kind of how people feel about this specific case, at the higher level, there is this problem that quadratic funding does not allow a way for people to express that they think a project has negative value, right? So if 10 people think that some media project has positive value, 10 people think that some media project has negative value, then with quadratic funding, the 10 people who think it's positive will contribute, and the people who think it's negative don't really have anything that they can do. And so the project still receives some subsidy, even though in reality, it might be very unclear whether the project provides value or whether it just makes a lot of people angry. So in round 5, we experimented with negative contributions. So we basically experimented with a mechanism where people can make a kind of contribution that, instead of adding money to a project, takes money away from that project and redistributes that money among all of the other projects. This actually did not work very well, right? So very few people actually ended up giving negative contributions. And people were kind of very upset at the possibility of this mechanism, right? They just did not like the idea that people could basically kind of use this mechanism to hurt each other. And so in round 6, we ended up not continuing with the negative contributions. Now, of course, in the future, it might be possible to try some mechanism like this again. So one thing that we did not do that we could do, for example, is make contributions anonymous and make the amounts invisible so that people can't just see how everyone else contributed and who contributed positively and who contributed negatively to whom, right? So this might be something that could be worth experimenting with in the future. But in general, in round 5, we made this experiment. It ended up not having much of an effect. And in round 6 and round 7, we did not try to make any negative contributions. And it turns out actually that this problem of these controversial media projects actually kind of went away by itself, right? So some of these projects are still receiving funding, but much less subsidies than before. The projects that are receiving the most subsidies through quadratic funding are projects that tends to be kind of fairly universally regarded as being very positive and important for the Ethereum ecosystem. So I think the situation kind of improved on its own, but no, it was still an interesting situation, right? And it's still something that I think we ended up learning a lot from. It's a problem that could obviously always come back at some point in the future. We don't know, but we'll see. We also discovered a new problem in round 5, which is a stability of income, right? So the challenge here is basically that we want it to be possible for people to rely on quadratic funding, not just for like a little bit of extra money on top of whatever they already get. We want people to be able to just live entirely off of quadratic funding as their income, right? We want people to be able to be what I call quadratic freelancers. And the problem is that income across these different rounds, well, is not necessarily very stable. And so in round 6, we did an experiment where we tried kind of automatically carrying over some donations from one round into the next round. It ended up actually not having too much of an effect. And so in round 7, we tried to do some other things. But this is one of the challenges that we're still, I think, continuing to watch. Another thing that we saw in round 5 was we started to see collusion and fake accounts, right? So because of how quadratic funding works, this is actually a problem, right? Like basically one user splitting their donations between 50 accounts can get a much larger match than one user participating honestly. And projects that are fake projects, if they can create 50 fake accounts and donate money to themselves, they can potentially get matching funds going to themselves. So this is a problem. Collusion, so like paying people to contribute to you, is also a problem. And so these were things that we were very actively watching out for and starting to come up with solutions for. Round 6, some user interface improvements that made it easier to contribute to many projects, and also some improved identity verification, added some phone verification to make it more difficult to make a large number of fake accounts. Round 7, we added layer 2 payments. We used the ZK sync rollup to reduce transaction fees. We added decentralized identity verification. Bright ID is this platform that's trying to create a decentralized and a social network-based mechanism for proving that some account corresponds to a unique person. And the media controversy seems to have kind of gone away on its own, right? So here are the top 10 recipients in round 7. And we see Bankless, a major Ethereum podcast, Week in Ethereum News, some DeFi tutorials, Ethereum Magicians, a core developer group, the Zero Knowledge podcast, a kind of very valuable podcast that just goes into zero knowledge proof, ZK Snark technology in depth, Radical Exchange Foundation. So one Twitter account, and I like ETH memes, and I like anti-prosynthesis too, but I think, but in general, right, like the kinds of projects that get the most matching are the kinds of projects that just have a huge amount of work and usually from multiple people going into them. And also in round 7, many DeFi projects are participating in matching, right? So now it's not just the Ethereum Foundation. Over the last 3 months, there has been this kind of bubble in the Ethereum ecosystem of these decentralized finance projects that have gotten a lot of money or a lot of attention or a lot of both. And so the biggest contribution came from Balancer Labs, but then there was also a Synthetics, Optimism, Chainlink, Yearn, some investment funds, some individuals. So this is good, right? This means that quadratic funding is becoming more sustainable because more projects are willing to participate in providing the matching. So conclusions, right? So I think, first of all, quadratic funding works. Quadratic funding seems to be providing good results. And another interesting conclusion is that the value of quadratic funding seems to be not just in allocating funds efficiently and allocating funds to projects that the Ethereum Foundation would not allocate funds to by itself, but also kind of creating this culture of this kind of open and democratic community participation, right? Where you have a lot of people that have a way to basically express their voice in terms of what things in the Ethereum ecosystem they consider to be valuable. And I think it's definitely helped to create this very wonderful and cooperative ecosystem. It's a lot of people are very actively participating in Gitcoin grants, and in general, it's been having these very good effects. Now, I do think there are areas where the quadratic funding can still improve. Like I think we probably want to have more ways to just make it easier for people to identify which projects are worth contributing to, which projects are not worth contributing to, allow for the possibility of kind of more delegation or things that look more like delegation potentially. We also wants to continue improving security. Another challenge, I think, is that there are a lot of the projects that are getting the most money from quadratic funding are coming from kind of a few regions. So they're either US-based or European. And it's relatively more difficult for projects from Asia or Africa, for example, to really get a lot start getting contributors through quadratic funding, and so trying to kind of make it more inclusive and just expand it in terms of kind of the outcomes is something that's also worth looking into. But another really important thing is just in any new community, it's going to take a few rounds for quadratic funding to start working well, right? So in the Ethereum community, it took at least, I think, 4 or 5 rounds for quadratic funding to start having kind of really good results and for people to really understand what's going on. The Gitcoin grants team is starting to try to apply quadratic funding to other contexts. So there's other blockchain communities that are starting to use it. They also did an experiment called a downtown stimulus, where they applied quadratic funding to businesses, like local businesses in the city that their team is based in, Denver and Colorado in the US. And that seems to have worked kind of fairly well, though I'm sure it would work much better if it was kind of continuing very reliably every 3 months for, say, 2 or 3 years. So if the first round doesn't go too well, kind of do not be discouraged, right? Like, it does take persistence to work well, and in general, quadratic funding is still evolving, it's still improving. We're still learning more and more with every round in terms of how to do it correctly, and kind of what kinds of norms the community should have in terms of what projects they contribute to and how they participate. So I'm looking forward to quadratic funding just continuing to work and be applied, and hopefully this is something that can be kind of initially incubated within the Ethereum ecosystem, but over time start to have a value going far beyond Ethereum. So thank you.